This series is based on a true story. The year 1984. In the first scene, we see a drunk man named Hank Franco banging on the door of a woman named Gray and insulting her, while two younger men, Paul Spruit and his friend Jose, try to pull him away. Soon after, police officers find Hank's lifeless body. Finding the culprit is easy, he called the police himself. Paul felt he had no choice, otherwise his mother could have been harmed. Paul had never had problems with the law before, unlike his father, Gerard Spruit, known as the Donald Duck salesman. The young man called the police and confessed everything. But the officers want to know why he moved the body. It defies logic. If Paul wanted to get rid of the evidence, why call the police? Could it have been a trick? During interrogation, Paul says that Hank was a bad man who didn't deserve to live. He would constantly get drunk and beat Gray, demanding money and threatening her. They had reported him to the police several times, to no avail. The detectives asked Paul to recount what happened in detail. That evening he got a call from his half-sister Bridget, daughter of Gray and Hank, saying Hank had been thrown out of a bar. Paul asked his friend Jose, who had a car, to go with him and pick Hank up. The man became extremely aggressive, and eventually the guys had to drop him off. But at some point Paul changed his mind and decided they should take Hank home before he caused trouble. Jose was firmly against it, but Paul insisted. According to him, he had no intention of taking Hank's life, it was a forced decision. The detectives asked the suspect about his childhood, particularly about his father, the Donald Duck salesman. Paul recalls that his father worked a lot and traveled frequently. He gave the impression of being a model family man. Everything was fine until Gerard was arrested. Since then, Gray had to cope on her own. She tried for a long time to hide from her son and daughter what Gerard had done. He lured a boy and a girl to his house under the pretext that he had a large collection of Donald Duck comics. That's where it all happened, while Gray and the kids were away on holiday. It was as if another person awakened in Gerard, or rather a monster. He cold-bloodedly took the lives of Bastian and Ellen, 3 years apart. Gerard's crimes affected everything, absolutely everything. Nothing could ever be the same for Paul. The detectives explained to Paul that a traumatic childhood cannot justify committing a crime. And no matter how bad Hank was, it didn't give Paul the right to take his life. The detectives know the suspect is hiding something, because his friend Jose told them everything in detail. In the prison cell, Paul cries. Bridget is brought in for questioning and says her parents divorced when she was 4. Later, after Gerard's arrest, they got back together. Gray was the type of woman who couldn't be alone. Bridget's own marriage fell apart, so she and her daughter Marcella live with Gray. Paul had his own place but still spent most of his time with them. At the time he worked at a radio and TV store and supported the family, something Bridget is very grateful for. However, after Gray let Hank back into her life, everything changed. Paul didn't trust his stepfather and would stay late to keep an eye on his sister and mother. Naturally, this infuriated Hank, who didn't hide his displeasure. Paul didn't like the fact that Bridget had also taken to drinking. What kind of example was she setting for her daughter? But Bridget insisted that alcohol calmed nerves and helped her cope with problems. Hearing Hank humiliating their mother downstairs, Paul immediately ran down and hit his stepfather. But Gray began defending Hank, repeating that it wasn't his fault and that things weren't so bad. Paul was tired of hearing it. Why did their mother keep defending Hank? In the present, during questioning, the detectives tell Paul that children often resemble their parents, and he is no exception. Could his father's tendencies have awakened in him? One day Paul finally decided to visit Gerard in prison, for the first time in years. Through tears Gerard asks his son for forgiveness. But Paul only wants to know why his father did it. Sadly, Gerard has no answer. Paul believes there is a monster living inside him too. But Bridget disagrees. Her father was a bad man too, so she fully understands Paul's feelings. In the present, the detective asks Bridget if she conspired with her brother to take Hank's life. She swears that's not how it happened. She called Paul because her father had snapped again. The plan was for Paul to come and calm him down, but things spiraled out of control. The police don't believe Bridget when she says Paul wasn't involved at all, that it was self-defense. But she can't be certain because she wasn't there. That night, Paul came to their mother's house with blood on his hands and was determined to turn himself in. He did what he had to do, and Bridget knew it. That's why she insisted on accompanying him to the police station. Paul asked her only one thing: to take care of their mother. Paul was arrested, but he insists his father had nothing to do with it. The young man did what he did because he saw no other way. The police have reason to believe the crime was premeditated, otherwise why would Paul have moved the body? The young man doesn't know what else to tell the police to prove that it was self-defense. The police take Paul to the crime scene to conduct a reconstruction. The person playing the role of the victim bears a strong resemblance to Hank Franco, for realism. Paul tells and shows the officers how it all happened. When he sees the person portraying Hank, emotions overwhelm him, but he does his best to stay in control. Paul remembers how Jose tried to stop him. At that moment the young man knocked Hank out with a table leg he had hidden in advance. Suddenly Hank regained consciousness and grabbed him. That's when Paul pulled a knife from his pocket. He was driven by pure rage, something that becomes apparent during the reenactment, which nearly triggers a panic attack in Paul. The year 1974, the carefree youth of 17-year-old Paul, who grew up in a loving family. He had always been very close to his father, they loved fishing together. Gerard seemed like a kind and compassionate man. Now 10 years later, Paul realizes it was just a mask. He's speaking with Dr. Van Noonen, a forensic psychiatrist tasked with determining whether Paul is fit to stand trial. The young man states that he told the police the facts, without distortion. Dr. Van Noonen emphasizes that this conversation is extremely important for Paul's future. He understands that saying how terrified he was when Hank attacked him. Paul claims he's capable of self-control, but every person's patience has a limit, especially when they've lived under the shadow of their father's crimes. The young man recalls how his father's name was all over the newspapers, yet neither his mother nor his sister spoke the truth. Unlike Hank, Gerard had never shown aggression, which made it all the more shocking for Bridget and Gray. It was also a shock for Paul, who learned everything from the news on TV. Since then, their family became the target of public harassment. In the present, the young man tells the psychiatrist that people like his father don't deserve to live. At the trial, Gerard claimed he didn't know why he did what he did. What the parents of those poor children went through, no one should ever have to endure. Gerard himself was a father, and he understood that. He expressed hope that his family wouldn't abandon him, despite everything. Of course Gerard was found guilty, he never denied his guilt. But it was his family who suffered more. They had to move and change their last name, but it didn't help. Psychological tests confirmed that Paul is impulsive. Now he can only hope for a fair trial, after all he turned himself in. Dr. Van Noonen explains to Paul that he is likely facing no less than 10 to 15 years in prison, whereas the young man believed he'd be looking at 2 or 3 years. That's what prompted him to go to the police voluntarily. Dr. Van Noonen asks the suspect if he regrets what he did now that he knows his confession won't lead to a lighter sentence. In 1978, Paul started dating a girl named Marika. He also entered the police academy. Life was finally coming together. Paul had finally stopped thinking about his father, never even told Marika, although she sensed something was eating at him. However, Paul was eventually expelled from the academy because of his father's crimes. He visited Gerard a few times, and according to Paul, his father looked pitiful. After a request for psychiatric evaluation, Gerard was committed to forced treatment instead of serving a prison sentence. Marika was pregnant, and the secret Paul had been keeping was eating away at him more than ever. Eventually he told her the truth. Fortunately Marika supported him, and soon the young couple began preparing a nursery. But at some point Marika just left. Paul never even saw his daughter, feeling like he could never wash away the stain of his father's crimes. Every time he dared to hope for something, it would collapse, all because of Gerard. Paul doesn't blame Marika, knowing she was afraid for their daughter's future. There was a time when he worked with escort girls, watching over them, since some clients like to use force. And Paul genuinely felt sorry for those women with such difficult lives. He always tried to help them in any way he could. One day when Paul defended one of the girls and nearly beat up her client, it caused problems. Paul could never be indifferent to women's suffering, as it reminded him of his mother. He had effectively taken on the role of the head of the family, because his father had failed them. If Hank Franco hadn't come back into Gray's life, everything might have turned out differently. Dr. Van Noonen asks Paul if he ever blamed his mother. The young man explains that she simply couldn't be alone, that's why she endured all of Hank's abuse. Paul felt helpless, and with each passing day, his inner anger only grew. Bridget coped by drinking, something Paul strongly disapproved of. He promised her he would deal with Hank. On that fateful night, Bridget called him in tears and said that Hank had beaten their mother again. For Paul it was the last straw, and he decided to rid the world of his hated stepfather. The investigation is complete, and Dr. Van Noonen honestly tells Paul that things don't look good for him. Paul doesn't understand why no one wants to hear him. He was only trying to protect his mother. Soon he calls her from prison but can't bring himself to admit that he's facing much more than 3 years. After hanging up, Paul cries. Soon after, the trial takes place. When the judge delivers the sentence, 5 years in prison, Paul feels relieved. It's not as bad as it could have been. The court took into account the defendant's personal circumstances. Gray and Bridget visit him regularly. Paul sees his imprisonment as a duty, a chance to break away from the past, and he makes plans for the future. Prison is a place where you cannot show weakness. Only the strongest survive. Despite being under compulsory treatment, Gerard is allowed to visit his son in prison. He advises him to request a psychiatric evaluation as well, it might help reduce his sentence. But Paul acknowledges his guilt and is ready to take responsibility. Still, Gerard asks his son to think it over carefully. He ruined his son's life, but now he wants to at least partially make amends. Conflicted, Paul refuses to continue the conversation. When the other inmates find out who Paul's father is, their reaction is predictable, but he is not someone who can't stand up for himself. Realizing that staying here could become unbearable, Paul expresses his willingness to undergo treatment. His lawyer explains that it's not that simple. In prison, Paul at least knows what to expect and will be released when his term ends, whereas the other option means he won't be freed until deemed mentally fit. Paul hesitates, but ultimately doesn't change his mind and continues to insist on compulsory treatment. It is the year 1985. The new lawyer says the same thing as the previous one, advising Paul to simply serve out the rest of his sentence. He starts corresponding with a girl named Miranda. The young man believes that after his release, a new life will begin for him. The court grants Paul's request for a psychiatric evaluation, and soon he is sent to a special facility where a series of tests will be conducted. During the interview, the doctor asks the potential patient about his relationship with his father, which makes him nervous. On the psychiatrist's advice, Paul decides to meet his father again. Gerard tells him that they are very much alike. They both in a fit of madness did terrible things. But Paul firmly denies this. Unlike his father, he acted in self-defense, not simply because he wanted to. One day another patient suggests an escape plan to Paul. Pulling it off alone would be problematic, but if they acted together, it might work in theory. Paul refuses. His correspondence with Miranda continues, but he is not ready to meet in person yet. One day Brigitte tells him over the phone that a drunk Jos came by demanding money. Because of Paul's case, he can't find work and insists that Gray and Brigitte compensate him. They are even thinking of moving. Hearing this, Paul loses his temper and starts smashing everything around him. Later, he approaches the patient who had earlier proposed the escape and says he's in. The plan is to take a French woman who works there hostage and demand freedom in exchange for her life. No sooner said than done. Paul and his accomplice take the French woman hostage, and threatening to harm her demand that the staff release them. They are forced to comply and open the door. The men force the woman into her car and steal it, planning to get to the train station. Paul's accomplice takes all the frightened woman's money. At the station, they let the woman go with her car and part ways. From the nearest phone booth, Paul calls his sister, who tells him he's all over the news. Paul promises to surrender to the police, but only after meeting with Jos and warning him. Brigitte says it's too late. Jos has just been taken into custody by the police for his own safety. Paul is furious but quickly pulls himself together and calls the police, saying he'll surrender right now if they let him see his mother. In the end, the police give him until 7 o'clock in the morning, no more. Paul heads straight home and apologizes to his mother and sister. He is sorry that his family is suffering because of him and is forced to move. Gray promises to stay. Noticing the wounds on his mother's hands, Paul realizes things are even worse than he thought. Gray asks him to just sit down and calm himself. Paul says that in the psychiatric facility he feels like he's in a cage. He could no longer just do nothing, and that's why he escaped. Gray assures him that Jos will not bother them again. After all, he's had a hard time too. He also suffered. When Gray goes to the kitchen for tea, Paul tells his sister that their mother has really deteriorated, even though she tries not to show it. The house is surrounded by police, even on the roof, and Paul knows he won't get away unnoticed. Suddenly Gray comes in tears, saying it's her fault. If she had gone to the police, it would be Hank in prison, not her son. Gray regrets that Paul and Brigitte had to go through all of this, but nothing can be changed now. Before Paul goes out to surrender to the police, Gray promises to wait for him at home. They all hug tightly and Paul says goodbye to them. The officers aim their guns at him. He does not try to resist. Thus Paul returns once again to the psychiatric clinic, but he will soon be transferred back to prison. The chief physician tells the patient that his act was extremely foolish, as his treatment was almost complete. Paul ends up back in prison. The first thing he decides to do is end his correspondence with Miranda, realizing that they have no future together. In the middle of the night, a guard wakes Paul and delivers bad news. He is allowed to attend his mother's funeral, under escort of course. There is too little time, and the young man does not manage to say everything he wanted. As the police lead him away, he sees his father, also under escort. Paul starts shouting, unwilling for Gerard to come anywhere near Gray. Soon Brigitte visits Paul, clearly drunk. What's more, she and her daughter Marcella have moved in with friends, which has only made things worse. Brigitte says nothing is working out in her life. Their fathers are their curse, and there's no escaping it. Paul and Gerard are allowed to talk. Gerard claims he has been cured, but his son doesn't believe it. If what he did was merely an impulsive act, then why did it happen twice? Paul drives his father away and tells the prison guards never to let him in again. The trial for Paul's escape which involve taking a hostage, takes place. The lawyer requests compulsory treatment for him, given his inability to control his emotional impulses. In the end, the court sentences him to 2 years in treatment. The year 1986. Paul feels he does not belong where he is. The year 1989. The young man undergoes another psychiatric evaluation. He states that there is nothing wrong with him, that he only pretended in order to be released sooner. However, the psychiatrists on the panel believe this is a stage of denial. This causes Paul to lose control, which only confirms the doctor's claims of his instability. As a result, his treatment is extended for another year. During his sister's next visit, the young man says emotionally how tired he is of all this and how much he wants to be declared healthy. Bridget, looking weary, says it's even worse on the outside. She has to work hard to provide for her daughter, and her personal life isn't working out. One day, in an attempt to break up a fight between 2 other inmates, Paul ends up in solitary confinement. The lawyer decides to request an independent psychiatric evaluation for him, which means Paul will have to tell his story all over again. He is so tired of it. The lawyer asks only one thing of him: avoid conflicts with anyone. The lawyer also advises Paul to give his father another chance. It could help Gerard recover. Against all odds, Miranda tries to visit Paul, but she is denied entry because she is not a relative and is not on the visitation list. He writes her a letter, asking her to come again. Finally, they meet in person. Paul admits that he stopped writing to her because he didn't want to ruin her life. Everyone sees him only as a criminal, without seeing the real him. Miranda says that's in the past. Now their future depends only on them. Paul decides to allow his father to visit him and asks him to answer honestly why he did it. Gerard replies that he doesn't know. He simply couldn't control it, but that doesn't make him a bad person. Although Paul doesn't believe that people can change, he forgives his father, for what he has done and for what he will do again. Miranda begins visiting Paul regularly. He feels that a great weight has been lifted off him. Soon the lawyer informs Paul of his father's death. Gerard passed away voluntarily after learning that he would never be released. There is also good news. Paul's case has been taken up by the court, and a hearing has already been scheduled. The panel concludes that Paul Spruit is completely healthy, and that his outbursts of rage are merely aspects of his character. On this basis, the court cancels his compulsory treatment. For Paul, hearing this is an enormous relief, and he is soon released from custody. Paul and Miranda live together. Before long, he finds a job, honestly telling his employer about his criminal record. Hearing Paul's story, the employer decides he deserves a second chance. He is not afraid of hard work. Thus begins his new life. He and Bridget remain very close. From then on, Paul gives talks to other inmates serving sentences for similar crimes. He wants each of them to understand that he is not just a criminal. He is also a husband, a friend, a younger brother. No one is immune to mistakes. Bridget starts living with a man older than herself, and Paul clearly doesn't like him. But Bridget is constantly in an alcoholic haze. She doesn't care about anything. One day, a former cellmate offers Paul easy money, but he refuses, even though his salary is sometimes barely enough and Miranda is pregnant. As always drunk, Bridget mentions that Marcella often says Bart behaves inappropriately. But Bridget doesn't believe her daughter, thinking she just wants attention. Hearing this, Paul loses his temper. Why does Bridget believe Bart and not her own daughter? The woman in turn repeats again that neither she nor Paul will ever be happy because of their fathers. He no longer wants to hear it. Soon Paul's employer accuses him of theft, something that has happened before. This is how he loses his job. Miranda is tired of them constantly having to borrow money from her parents and asks Paul just to stay away from her. Could his sister have been right, and they are forever branded for their father's crimes? Bridget promises Paul that she will quit drinking and change. He asks about Marcella. Bridget admits she doesn't know where her daughter is now. The girl has moved in with her biological father. In desperation, Paul meets with his former cellmate Tuncha and says he's in. The plan is to attack a local horse dealer and extort money from him. Paul has no other choice. He must provide for Miranda and their newborn child. Soon he gets a call from the hospital and rushes there. Bridget is in critical condition due to advanced cirrhosis of the liver that has developed into cancer. Surgery is now impossible because she is too weakened. Bridget asks her brother only to promise that he will tell Marcella how much she loves her. Not long after, Paul is already bringing flowers to his sister's grave. When Tuncha hands Paul a gun, he doesn't like it. Tuncha explains that it will make things easier for them. But everything goes wrong when Tuncha and the horse dealer shoot each other. Paul realizes too late what he has gotten himself into, and on top of that, there was no money in the man's car. Paul tries to call for help. The wounded Tuncha tells him to run, since he has a wife and child. Paul manages to hide before the police arrive. When he returns late at night, Miranda immediately senses something is wrong. The news reports a botched robbery and 2 bodies, but the police believe there was more than one perpetrator. Miranda guesses they are talking about Paul. He decides to surrender to the police, again. The last moments spent with his wife and child are the most precious to him. Seeing the police cars, Paul remembers how his father was arrested. After hugging his wife and daughter one last time, Paul gets into the police car. A voiceover then tells us that Paul Spruit was sentenced on April 22, 1993, to 6 years in prison. In prison, he acquired several professional skills. After his release, he worked as a driver for several years. Later, he also had a son. His marriage to Miranda did not last long, but shortly after the divorce he met another woman. Paul currently teaches criminal law in schools.